besides note list, what other components would need access to note data? The form, right? This data's got to come from somewhere and it's got to get saved somewhere. And ultimately, we're going to make it so that when we click on one of these, it loads up the form with that data. Now, those two components can't talk directly to each other, because the only way to get data into a component from the outside is through props. And our opportunity to pass in props is when we render that component with JSX. And note list isn't what's rendering the form, right? Main is rendering both of them. So that data needs to live at least as far up as main. I'm going to go ahead and pull it all the way up to app, because I think it will make our life easier later on. So I'm going to make app actually responsible for this note data. So when an app is managing its own data, what do we use? Not props, but state. So this is what we were trying to do with app.flicks in Michael Baywatch. We were basically maintaining our own internal state. Now, we didn't get the re-rendering of the DOM for free like we do in React. But that was the idea, to get us used to the idea that we want to manage this data apart from its presentation. So we have to elevate the state up out of note list, because it needs to be available in other components too. So it needs to be at least as high up as main. We're going to pull it all the way up to app. Sorry, notes. We were just pretending. So in app.js, we want to store the list of notes on the component's state. How do we set the initial state for a component? In the constructor. We make changes to it with set state. Now, in order to have a constructor, it has to be a real class, right? So can't do that in a functional stateless component, which the name stateless hopefully gives away. Can't have state. Oops. So constructor. And a whole bunch of stuff happens in components constructor. So we need to make sure that we call that. When you give a method the same name as a method on its parent, it's going to override that, but you can still call the original one by calling super inside there, right? Just like in some other languages like Java. Then we want to set our state. So this dot state equals an object, and we want that object to have a key of notes. So this dot state dot notes is going to be this object, the object with these two notes in it. Just change the data a little bit so I can make darn sure I know where it's coming from. So how do we get this data all the way from here down to note list? The only way to get data from the outside into a component is, yes, I sound like a broken record, but I really want to emphasize this point, props. So where can I pass props into note list? Right here in main, right? Which means that before we can pass this data down to note list, we need to get it into main. So here's where we're rendering main. So we want to pass a prop to that. We'll call it notes. And what should it be? From inside app, how do I get that list of notes that I saved on state? Here it is. So this dot state is this entire object. I just want the notes out of here. What if state also has birthday in here or something? Right? This dot state dot notes. That passes it on to main. Main, like note list, is a stateless functional component. So instead of this dot props inside here, since the whole thing is one big function, the props are actually passed in as an argument. So when I render note list and I want to pass those notes along, how do I get to them? Who was starting to talk? That was Nick. So props gives us all our props. I meant to. No, props is right. I want a specific prop out of it, right? So props dot the name of that prop, and that prop is notes, right? When we rendered main, we named our prop notes. So it would be props dot notes. So then down in note list, we need to make sure we have our props. Then I just need to make two tiny little changes. What do I need to change? Before we had a local variable called notes, and that's where the notes were. Where are they now? So these are all our props. When we rendered note list, we passed in a prop called notes that contains all of the notes. So we get those notes out of props by saying props.notes. So we want to make this note IDs array out of the keys from props.notes. And once we have the ID of an individual note, we get the note out of props.notes. There is no local variable called notes. And pass in the note ID. Yeah, it's just a naming convention. That's what they're called in React. And if it's an actual class, like noteform is, this dot props will always be the name because React is assigning that name. It's not a reserved word in JavaScript, but that is the name that React will use. Now, since it's just an argument to this function, we can name the argument whatever we want from this side. But we'll also drive ourselves crazy if we name it something other than props. Yeah, but yeah, it's not a magic word. Am I filling your head with lies? Did it work? Hey, from app state, the fanciest. It did it. We stored the notes up on app state. They're still hard-coded in there. Not coming from a database or anything. But by golly, they're there. Pass them from there as a prop into main. And from inside app.js, it's this.state.notes. And then as far as every other component is concerned, it does not care that it was from the state of app. All it cares about is that it's the prop that was passed in. So from inside main, this will simply be props.notes. And if main were a class instead of a function, it would be this.props.notes. So now we can get to these notes from props.notes. What do we want to do with them? All main wants to do with them is pass them on to note list. So here's note list. It also receives a prop called notes. Its value is props.notes. So inside note list, we take that object, props.notes, and we get the keys. The strings, note 4 and note 5. Make an array of them. So then we can map over that array. And what map does is call the provided function once for every item in the array, and it passes that item as an argument to our anonymous function here, our callback. We'll name it node ID because that's what it is. And then to get the note with that ID out of the notes, well, the list of notes is props.notes. And to access something in a specific key, we can use dot or square bracket. In this case, it has to be square bracket because we have the ID in a variable. Props.notes, square bracket, note ID. And we haven't made a change to the note component in a very long time because it doesn't care. As long as it gets its props.note and that thing has a title and a body, it's happy. Because its job is simply to say, given a note, this is how you render that note to the page. How that note gets there is someone else's responsibility. And note list's job is to loop over all the notes that it's given in props.notes and render a note for each one. It doesn't care where they come from either, as long as it gets its props that includes an object that's shaped like that. It's happy to do it. So now we store still hard-coded notes in apps state. Now we said that we wanted it so that when you click one of these, it loads that data into the form, right? So we have to learn a few new tricks to do that.